amber waves swayed in the cool breath of daybreak. The rustling fields of wheat stretched for acres, and to a young girl, the golden grain seemingly stretched for eternity, touching the horizon of cerulean blue. The sunbeams kissed her as she drank in the morning air. Cattle grazed in grace upon the humble hills, bellowing a moan of contentment from time to time. Come July, the last of the remaining stalks were harvested, and the straw, baled and placed in the barn as bedding. The girl watched as her pawpaw took milk cans from the spring house and placed them upon the wagon harnessed to a lone horse, the girl named Clumps, who was patiently waiting his marching orders. Pawpaw waved her over with a big welcoming smile, his bald scalp shining with sweat. "Here you go, precious," he said with a kiss to her forehead and placing a tin bowl of chicken feed in her arms. "You named the chicks yet, darling?" "Yes, Pawpaw," she said, giggling. "I shoulda known," he chuckled. "You done named all my animals. Don't I get say on any?" She shook her head teasingly. "Ha, just like your mama." He sighed with a smirk. Turning to mount the horse, he stopped, reaching in his trouser pocket. "And this is for you, precious." He handed her a rectangular package, wrapped in butcher paper. "Open it," he said with the same infectious smile that never seemed to leave his face. She pulled the string that bound the wrapping together, then impatiently unraveled the package. She gasped. It was a book, a children's Bible with colorful illustrations. Papa got to one knee. "Now, precious, you take care of this book. Hold it dear to your heart. The good Lord has blessed us beyond measure. From the shackles of slavery to this land of milk and honey, you do right by him, you hear? And he'll do right by you." "Yes, Papa," she exclaimed excitedly. "Open to Scripture." She opened it up to Proverbs 18:10. Pawpaw closed his eyes and quoted the scripture verbatim from memory. "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous man runs into it and is safe." She was always amazed of his ability to memorize every scripture. The story he shared of sneaking under the crawl space of his master's chapel and committed to memory as much of the good book as possible. He said the Lord's word is free to all, no matter how much some men want it not so. The girl watched as he opened his eyes in such tranquility, letting the words linger about them. Pawpaw stood to his feet before planting a kiss upon her brow once more. Mounting the horse, Pawpaw smiled, nodded, and tugged on Clump's reins. "By grace of day, you be washed for supper." "Yes, Pawpaw," she said. She continued to watch as Pawpaw, Clumps, and the loaded wagon of dairy, grain, and other goods disappeared down the road. From all corners of the farm, workers gathered for the mid-morning tasking. Her uncles, cousins, and hired hands stood shoulder to shoulder, each with some farming tool leaned against their right shoulder, handles up. A rake, scythe, hoe, or the like were held with the care soldiers would to long guns. They all stood quietly as her uncle read off a ledger from Pawpaw, labors of the day. After the rigid formality, they would laugh among themselves before heading towards another task. A stranger watched from down the road, observing the men. The girl looked at the stranger, but didn't find his presence strange. Men came around looking for work occasionally, however. When the girl glanced away for a brief moment, the stranger had disappeared. From mid-morning to afternoon, the girl tended her chores in a hurried jubilance. A smile uncontrollably caressed her lips, unable to contain the bubbling excitement of owning her first and only book. And it wasn't any book, but the good book. The book that spoke of time and eternity, clay and soul, life and death, eternity, the very breath of the Creator. However, chores were to be completed before she could submerge herself in the living water, as Pawpaw called it. She occasionally reached for the book tucked in her apron pocket to confirm it hadn't fallen out. She continued to hand toss feed to the frenzied delight of the clucking chickens, before counting the newly hatched chicks a fifth time that hour. By noon, there was a rumbling from the pasture, a resounding perpetual thunder cascading from the hills. The cattle were spooked, stampeding from east to west, then scampering out of view. Flocks of cackling grackles hastened to the air in unison. A murder of crows escaped from tree to sky in rapid succession, cawing in protest. Pinging of steel near the barn, followed by a reverberation of pops and echoing whistles, warbled the air around her. There was a volley of gunfire from the east and rhythmic controlled single shots from the west. The chickens became restless, and the young girl departed the chicken coop and ran toward the road where last her pawpaw left towards the market, and the stranger stood earlier. Another salvo of pops rattled closer from down the road and rippled in all directions. From the opposite direction, there was a rustling in the distant trees, followed by screams and squeals. Her eyes widened. Her feet rooted in the road, and for a moment, she couldn't move. A clatter of wood and wheels upon rock and dirt jostled violently behind her. Clumps was in a full gallop, his hooves clomping thunderously against the road. A mere second saved the girl from a trampling of hoof and wheel. The wagon was shattered to matchwood, and Clump's hide was crisscrossed with veins of bright red blood. "Where is Pawpaw?" she shouted, gasping for air in the lifted dust. Clumps continued to gallop beyond the ranch, any beyond the grove of post oak. The gunshots were drifting nearer in sporadic clusters, and howls were heard, not howls of lamentation or pain, but of drunken elation. The girl ran across the property into the sheep enclosure, who, like the cattle, had scattered to the most western part of the meadow. She laid on her belly behind a long trough, trembling. 3 men appeared, all armed with long guns and freckled in blood. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. One of the men quoted, looking about the property. It was the stranger from the road. Another spat, tobacco from his blackened mouth. "Look at this shit," the spitter exclaimed. "Ain't no nigger got reason for land like this. We struggling and this nigger living off good land, untouched," the third man said. "Fucking burn this fucker to the ground," the spitter added, aiming his shotgun at a lamb that hobbled back to the trough, injured and lost. "Nah, don't kill him. Dem sumbitches is mine," the third man said. "I tell you what, if that goddamn horse is still useful, I'm taking that fucker too." The spitter spat. "Let's finish the goddamn task before we discuss possessing the spoils," the stranger said. All 3 men went about the property in a barrage of gunfire. The girl remained hidden behind the trough until the silent sheep returned under cover of dusks, reddened sky, and yawning crickets. She'd hope any time Pawpaw's voice would ring in the silence, but it didn't. And all the animals waned in silence, and so did she. By dawn, she heard strange voices from the main house and shattering of glass, so she slumped toward the shallow gully that aligned the pasture and shadowed the road. Again, a crackling salvo of gunfire echoed across hill and plain. Ahead, a man lied face down in the shallow waters. He wore familiar trousers. It was one of the hired hands. She had seen death of all animal and creature, but never a man, never a human. The water meandered the body and continued red down the declination of the gully. Where the gorge bends towards the west, the water babbles, and at this point, the road and water are adjacent. And there were bodies on the road, male and female, family and familiar. Then a small child, and another. All around was the newly dying and the dead in all manner of contorted positions, most of the bodies face down with blood-stained backs. As she tread upon the pink and crimson of the slain, her body quaked and tears fell her face. Yet Paw Paw was not seen among the damned. She walked without destination and sought without hope, laughter and shouting in the distance. Staying off the road, the girl crouched to a sidled creep among the brush. A multitude of men gathered at the base of a tree, resupplying themselves with ammunition. She remembered a few light faces from a county over, Bible-toters and lovers of God, but now they toted long guns and traveled in groups from the tree, some heavily stained in blood. The girl watched the men being dispatched from the base of the tree in an almost rabid torridity, some eyes welling in blood-red rage. The tree branches above the men creaked and hissed. Leaves rustled in agitation and fell to the earth. The girl's eyes climbed the oak where the bedecked branches bowed like the weeping willow. Ashen bodies weighed the branches stiffly. Their eyes, though wide, were sightless. And there, among the bodies that swayed the sacrilegious in profane pendulums, was Paw Paw. The girl dropped to her knees, clamping her lips from the cries within her, rocking to gain control. The stranger from the road stood beneath the dangling feet amongst a hurried mob and stated absolutely, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, to have dominion over every creature and living thing that move upon the earth. So be strong and courageous, my brothers, and possess the land the good Lord has given you." Dropping her hands, the girl gazed hopeless at Paw Paw, unaware of the double-barreled shotgun trained at her from the boskage. A snap of a twig, and eyes meet, blue, wide, and full of fear. It was a boy. He trembled. The shaken barrel lowered slightly. She followed the boy's gaze toward the book at her side. It was the good book out of her pocket and sullied by the earth. She grabbed it and cradled the book against her chest. Tension filled the air between them. Not a word whispered. Their eyes fixated upon each other with questions seemingly never to be answered. Incoherent voices approached, breaking the silence, traversing the foliage. With his left hand outstretched, the boy motioned her to get lower to the ground against the brush, and hushed her, bringing his finger to his lips. In moments, the boy was gone. She cried in the arboreal shadows until her eyes closed. A week later, surveyors and gravediggers found her tattered and emaciated, clutching her book, the good book, the same book the stranger used to hunt and kill her entire family in his absolute righteous conviction. And as an unknown man cradled her towards help, she peered weakly at corpses being placed in a mass grave to be buried, without a prayer, without a care.